Sometimes destiny does not knock on your door. Sometimes it runs straight into you. The October sun bathed Manhattan in golden light as Alexander Hayes stepped out of a black sedan and adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit. At 40, he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in America. His company had offices on 3 continents. Financial magazines called him visionary. Business networks called him unstoppable. Yet every achievement seemed to echo through an empty penthouse at night. That afternoon, he had agreed to attend a community innovation fair sponsored by his foundation. It was the kind of public appearance his advisors encouraged. A few speeches, a few photographs, then back to work. At least, that was the plan. The plaza outside the event center buzzed with families, volunteers, and children carrying handmade projects. Music drifted through the air while colorful banners fluttered in the breeze. Alexander offered polite smiles as he moved through the crowd. Then something unexpected happened. 4 children came racing around a corner chasing a small remote-controlled car. Before Alexander could react, one of them bumped gently into him. The others stopped immediately. "Sorry, mister," a young boy said, looking up with wide gray-blue eyes. Alexander smiled. "No harm done." Another boy stepped forward and laughed. "See? I told you he would not be mad." 2 girls joined them, both carrying matching science project folders. For a moment, Alexander simply stared. Something felt strangely familiar. The children looked about 8 years old. They were clearly siblings. Their expressions were different, yet certain features repeated across all 4 faces. The same eyes, the same smile, the same confident way of speaking. "You guys are a team, huh?" Alexander asked. "We are quadruplets," one of the girls announced proudly. "That means there are 4 of us at the same time." "I know what quadruplets are," Alexander replied with a laugh. "I am Alexander." "I am Ethan," the first boy said. "I am Elijah," the second added. "I am Emma," said one girl. "And I am Ella," the other finished. The children spoke so naturally that Alexander found himself smiling more than he had all week. Then Ethan tilted his head and looked at him carefully. "That is weird." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What is weird?" Ethan pointed toward Elijah. "You kind of look like our brother." The other 3 immediately nodded. "A little," Emma agreed. "Especially around the eyes," Ella added. Alexander laughed softly, but the comment landed somewhere deep inside him. The children continued talking as if they had said nothing unusual, yet he could not stop looking at them. The similarity was impossible to explain. Their gray-blue eyes looked almost identical to his own. Even the way Elijah folded his arms reminded Alexander of photographs he had seen of himself as a child. Before he could ask another question, a familiar voice carried across the plaza. "Kids, there you are." Alexander turned. Time seemed to slow. Standing near the entrance was a woman he had not seen in 8 years. Naomi Carter. Her dark curls moved gently in the autumn breeze. Her warm brown eyes widened the instant she recognized him. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Around them, the fair continued normally. Children laughed. Volunteers chatted. Music played softly in the distance. But Alexander barely heard any of it, because the 4 children beside him had already run toward Naomi, and as they surrounded her with effortless affection, a question he could not yet answer began forming in the back of his mind. For the rest of the afternoon, Alexander could not focus on the event around him. He delivered his scheduled remarks, posed for photographs, and greeted community leaders, yet his attention kept drifting back to the same place. Every few minutes, he found himself searching the crowd for Naomi and the 4 children. They seemed to move through the fair like a small universe of their own. Ethan led discussions at a robotics booth. Elijah confidently demonstrated a model bridge he had built from recycled materials. Emma explained a science presentation to visitors with remarkable patience. Ella spent nearly an hour helping younger children decorate art projects. Alexander watched from a distance, fascinated by how different they were and how connected they seemed. At the same time, the more he observed them, the more unsettled he became. It was not only their eyes. It was not only their smiles. It was the way they carried themselves. Ethan had a habit of pushing his sleeves upward whenever he concentrated. Alexander had done the same thing his entire life. Emma tilted her head slightly before answering difficult questions, exactly as Alexander did during interviews. Even their laughter sounded strangely familiar. He tried to dismiss the thoughts as coincidence, but they returned again and again. Late in the afternoon, a student innovation competition began inside the community center. Families gathered in a large auditorium while judges reviewed presentations. By chance, Alexander ended up seated only a few rows behind Naomi and the children. He could hear them whispering encouragement to one another before taking the stage. "You have got this," Naomi told them softly. "Just be yourselves." The warmth in her voice made Alexander smile despite himself. 8 years had passed, yet some things about her had not changed at all. He still remembered the weekend they met in Seattle during a leadership conference. He remembered long conversations about purpose, family, and dreams. He remembered thinking that he wanted to know her better. Then life had intervened. Opportunities disappeared. Contact was lost. Eventually, he convinced himself that chapter was over. Yet now she sat only a few feet away. When the presentations began, the 4 children impressed everyone in the room. They spoke confidently, worked together effortlessly, and treated each other with genuine kindness. Several judges praised their teamwork. Alexander felt an unexpected sense of pride growing inside him, though he could not explain why. After the competition ended, families gathered in the lobby. As people celebrated, one of the event organizers approached Naomi carrying a stack of participant folders. "I almost forgot these," she said. "The registration records and certificates for the kids." Naomi thanked her and accepted the folders. As she turned, one slipped from her hands. Papers scattered across the floor. Without thinking, Alexander stepped forward. "To help. Let me get those," he said. He knelt and gathered several sheets. Then his eyes landed on a document near his shoe. It was a participant registration form. 4 names appeared together at the top: Ethan Carter, Elijah Carter, Emma Carter, Ella Carter. Below the names was a date. Alexander froze. His pulse quickened. He looked again to make sure he had not misread it. The birth date was identical on all 4 forms. 8 years ago, the exact period that aligned perfectly with the last time he had seen Naomi. Slowly, he lifted his gaze toward her. Across the crowded lobby, Naomi's expression changed the moment she realized which paper he was holding. And in that instant, Alexander understood that the question forming in his heart was no longer going away. The crowd in the lobby seemed to fade into the background as Alexander stood holding the registration form. Around him, parents celebrated, children laughed, and volunteers carried supplies toward the exits. Yet all he could see was the date printed on the paper. 8 years ago, the same year he had met Naomi. The same year, she had vanished from his life without explanation. Slowly, he handed the form back to her. Their fingers brushed briefly, and neither spoke. The silence between them felt heavier than any conversation. Naomi carefully gathered the remaining papers and placed them inside the folder. The 4 children were busy comparing ribbons and certificates with other students, completely unaware of the tension growing around them. Alexander watched Naomi for a moment before finally speaking. "Can we talk?" His voice was calm, but the question carried years of confusion behind it. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. "Not here." He nodded. "Then somewhere else." For a few seconds she appeared uncertain. Then she glanced toward the children and gave a small nod. "There is a coffee shop across the street." 20 minutes later, the children sat at a corner table enjoying hot chocolate, while Naomi and Alexander occupied a quieter booth nearby. Outside, autumn sunlight reflected off passing cars and drifting leaves. Inside, the scent of coffee and cinnamon filled the air. The atmosphere should have felt comfortable. Instead, Alexander felt as though every answer he had searched for during the past 8 years sat directly across from him. Naomi wrapped both hands around a cup of tea. She looked composed, but he noticed the tension in her shoulders. "You look exactly the same," he said softly. A faint smile appeared. "That is a generous exaggeration." "No, it is not." For a brief moment, old memories surfaced between them. Conversations by the waterfront, shared dreams, the feeling that they had known each other far longer than a single weekend. Then reality returned. Alexander glanced toward the children. Ethan was explaining something enthusiastically while Elijah listened. Emma and Ella were laughing about a drawing one of them had made. Once again, the similarity struck him. "They are remarkable kids." Naomi's expression softened immediately. "They are my whole world." Alexander nodded. "I can see that." Silence settled between them. Finally, he asked the question that had been growing inside him since the moment he saw the birth dates. "Naomi, why did you disappear?" She looked down at her tea. The steam curled upward between them. "I did not disappear. Alexander frowned slightly. I searched for you. Naomi looked up, surprise flashing across her face. You searched for me? For months. The answer came without hesitation. I called every number I had. I contacted conference organizers. I even went back to the hotel where we met. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. I thought you left. I thought you left. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then something shifted in her expression. Confusion, regret, realization. As though an old misunderstanding had suddenly become visible. Across the room, the children continued laughing together. Their happiness felt almost surreal against the emotional storm building between the adults. Alexander followed their gaze again. This time he noticed something else. Ethan smiled exactly the way he had as a boy. Elijah tilted his head while listening. Emma folded her hands when she concentrated. Ella raised one eyebrow whenever she was skeptical. Tiny details. Familiar details. Too many to ignore. Slowly, Alexander turned back toward Naomi. His heart pounded harder than it had during any business negotiation of his life. He chose his words carefully. Naomi, he said quietly, there is something I need to ask you. The warmth disappeared from her face. She already knew the question before he spoke it. And as her eyes drifted toward the 4 children sitting across the room, Alexander realized she had been carrying the answer alone for a very long time. The noise of the coffee shop faded into a distant murmur as Alexander held Naomi's gaze. Outside, golden leaves drifted across the sidewalk while the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The question sat between them before it was ever spoken aloud. Naomi knew it. Alexander knew it. Even the silence seemed to know it. Finally, Alexander took a slow breath. Naomi, he said carefully, are the children mine? The words were quiet, yet they carried the weight of 8 unanswered years. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, not because she was surprised, not because she was angry, but because she had imagined this moment countless times and still did not know how to make it easier. Across the room, Ethan, Elijah, Emma, and Ella continued laughing over their certificates, completely unaware that their lives stood on the edge of a life-changing truth. Alexander watched Naomi's expression. He had spent years reading investors, executives, and negotiators. He recognized hesitation. He recognized fear. What he saw now was something different. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had carried a burden alone for a very long time. Please, he said softly, just tell me the truth. Naomi lowered her eyes to the table. Her fingers tightened around the warm cup of tea. When I found out I was pregnant, she began, I tried to find you. Alexander's heart tightened. I know. She nodded slowly. At first, I thought it would be simple. We had shared something real. I believed I would reach you. Her voice remained calm, but emotion lingered beneath every word. Then the calls went nowhere. The emails were never answered. The addresses stopped working. Alexander felt a familiar ache. The misunderstanding that had separated them suddenly seemed even more tragic. Naomi continued. Then I learned there were 4 babies. A faint smile touched her lips despite everything. The doctors were shocked. I was shocked. Alexander almost laughed at the image. 4 children at once. 4 lives beginning together. 4 futures depending on one frightened young woman. I was scared, she admitted. But the moment I heard their heartbeats, I knew I would do whatever was necessary. Alexander looked toward the children again. Suddenly, every achievement in his life felt strangely small beside that sacrifice. Why did you never try again later? He asked quietly. Naomi followed his gaze toward the children. Because they became my priority. Her eyes softened. Every day brought something new. Doctor appointments, school registrations, homework, fevers, birthdays, dreams. She smiled gently. Life moved forward. Silence settled again. Then Alexander asked the question he was almost afraid to hear answered. So the truth is, Naomi turned back toward him. For a long moment, she simply looked at him. Then she nodded once. A small movement. Yet it changed everything. Yes, she whispered. They are your children. Alexander felt the world stop. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough for his heartbeat to stumble. Every strange resemblance, every familiar gesture, every impossible coincidence suddenly became clear. Ethan, Elijah, Emma, Ella, his children. The realization washed over him in waves of disbelief, wonder, regret, and overwhelming emotion. He looked through the window toward the fading sunlight. 8 years. 8 birthdays. 8 Christmas mornings. 8 years he would never get back. Then his eyes returned to the 4 children laughing together across the room. And for the first time, he realized that the greatest miracle was not discovering them. It was discovering them before it was too late. The drive back to his penthouse that evening felt longer than any journey Alexander Hayes had ever taken. Manhattan glowed beneath the evening sky, its towers illuminated with millions of lights, yet he barely noticed the view beyond. The car window. His mind remained fixed on 4 faces. Ethan, Elijah, Emma, Ella, his children. The words still felt unreal. For years he had built companies, signed contracts, and expanded an empire across the world. Yet somewhere beyond quarterly reports and board meetings, 4 extraordinary children had been growing up without ever knowing who he was. When he finally arrived home, the silence inside the penthouse felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It felt empty. He walked past floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and stopped beside a shelf filled with awards and photographs from his professional life. For the first time, none of it impressed him. He found himself wondering what he had been doing on each of the children's birthdays. Which meeting had occupied him while they learned to walk? Which business trip had taken place when they spoke their first words? The realization was painful, but it was not anger he felt. It was grief for moments that could never be recovered. The following morning, Alexander canceled several appointments. His executive assistant nearly dropped her tablet in surprise. In 10 years, he had never canceled an entire day without a major emergency. Yet this felt more important than any corporate crisis. Shortly after noon, he arrived at a small neighborhood park where Naomi had agreed to meet him. The 4 children were playing near a soccer field, while Naomi sat on a bench beneath a maple tree painted with autumn colors. Alexander joined her quietly. For several minutes, they simply watched the children run across the grass. "They have no idea, do they?" he asked. Naomi shook her head. "No, have they ever asked about their father?" Her eyes followed the children. "Many times." Alexander swallowed hard. "What did you tell them?" A faint smile appeared on her face. That he was someone who never had the chance to know them. The answer surprised him. She could have told them he abandoned them. She could have filled their minds with resentment. Instead, she had protected a truth she did not fully understand herself. "Why?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked at him. "Because I never believed you chose this." The honesty in her voice left him speechless. Across the field, Ethan kicked a soccer ball toward Elijah while Emma and Ella cheered from the sidelines. Their laughter drifted through the cool afternoon air. Alexander felt something shift inside him. Not guilt. Responsibility. The kind that settled deep within a person's heart and refused to leave. "What happens now?" he asked. Naomi considered the question carefully. "That depends on you." Alexander looked toward the children again. Ethan was helping his sister tie a loose shoelace. Elijah was explaining a game rule to another child. Small moments. Ordinary moments. Yet they felt priceless. "I want to know them," he said. "Not because of my name. Not because they are my heirs. Because they are my children." Naomi studied him for several seconds. Then, for the first time since their reunion, some of the caution disappeared from her eyes. At that exact moment, the soccer ball rolled across the field and stopped near Alexander's feet. Ethan waved from the distance. "Mr. Hayes, can you kick it back?" Alexander picked up the ball and smiled. He had built an empire worth billions. Yet somehow, that simple request felt like the most important opportunity of his life. Over the next several days, Alexander became a quiet but consistent presence in the children's lives. He did not arrive with expensive gifts or grand promises. Instead, he showed up. On Wednesday afternoon, he attended a school robotics demonstration. On Friday evening, he sat through a community music recital where Emma played a short piano piece. On Saturday morning, he joined Naomi and the children at a local farmer's market. Each visit revealed another piece of the life Naomi had built without him. And with every passing day, his admiration for her grew. One chilly evening, after the children had gone inside a community center for an after-school program, Alexander and Naomi remained on a bench outside beneath strings of warm lights. The sounds of laughter drifted through the windows while autumn leaves moved gently across the sidewalk. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Alexander looked at her. "I still do not understand how you did it." Naomi smiled. Faintly. "Did what?" "Raised 4 children at the same time." She laughed softly for the first time in days. Some days I'm not sure how I survived it either. The warmth of the moment faded as memories returned to her eyes. The first year was the hardest. Alexander listened carefully. There were nights when none of them wanted to sleep. Days when I worked double shifts and still worried about rent. Times when one child had a fever while another needed help with school projects. She shook her head gently. Everything felt impossible. Alexander lowered his gaze. Every word reminded him of years he had never seen. Why did you never ask anyone for help? Naomi looked toward the building where the children were gathered. I did. Her voice remained calm. My mother helped when she could. Friends helped when they could. But ultimately, they were my responsibility. Alexander nodded slowly. And you never hated me? Naomi seemed genuinely surprised by the question. No, not even once. She considered it carefully. I was hurt. I was confused. But hate takes energy. I needed all of my energy for them. The answer struck him harder than any accusation could have. For years, he had imagined that if he ever found Naomi again, she would resent him. Instead, she had chosen grace. A long silence settled between them. Then Naomi reached into her purse and removed a small envelope. The paper looked worn from age. She handed it to him. What is this? Alexander asked. The last letter I wrote to you. His chest tightened immediately. He opened it carefully. The date at the top was 8 years old. The handwriting was elegant but uneven in places. As he read, he realized it had been written shortly after the children were born. She had described their tiny hands, their first days at home, her hope that somehow he would find them. Near the end of the letter, one sentence stopped him completely. If you ever learn about them one day, I hope you know they were always loved. Alexander stared at the words as emotion filled his chest. Naomi had written that letter during one of the most difficult periods of her life. Yet there was no bitterness. Only love. Only hope. Slowly, he folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. I am sorry, he said quietly. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. I know. For the first time since their reunion, those words felt less like forgiveness and more like understanding. And as the lights from the community center glowed against the evening sky, both of them realized that the hardest part of the story was no longer the years they had lost. It was learning how to build a future from the second chance they had been given. Winter arrived in New York with clear skies and sharp morning air. By December, Alexander had become a familiar part of the children's routine. He attended school events, helped with science projects, and learned which snacks each child preferred after class. Yet despite the growing comfort between them, he understood something important. Being their biological father did not automatically make him their dad. That title had to be earned. One Saturday morning, Naomi arrived at a local community center to pick up the children after a weekend workshop. Through the glass entrance, she paused when she saw Alexander sitting on the floor surrounded by Ethan, Elijah, Emma, and Ella. Pieces of a complicated model city were scattered across a large table. The children were laughing while Alexander listened carefully to a debate about where a miniature bridge should be placed. He was not leading the conversation. He was simply participating, watching, learning. Naomi smiled quietly. For years, she had imagined many versions of this reunion. None of them looked quite like this. Later that afternoon, the group walked through a neighborhood holiday market filled with lights and music. Vendors sold hot chocolate, handmade ornaments, and winter scarves. The children rushed from booth to booth, excited by every display. Alexander followed closely behind, carrying shopping bags and listening to 4 conversations at once. For perhaps the first time in his life, he felt completely disconnected from business, investments, and quarterly reports. And he had never felt more content. As evening approached, they stopped beside a large Christmas tree in the center of the square. Thousands of lights illuminated the surrounding streets. Families gathered nearby taking photographs. The children wandered toward a display of handmade toys while Naomi and Alexander remained a few steps behind. They trust you, Naomi said softly. Alexander watched the children. I hope so. They do. Her voice carried certainty. More every week. The words meant more to him than any professional achievement ever had. Yet before he could respond, Ethan suddenly appeared beside them. His expression seemed unusually serious. Can I ask you something? Alexander smiled. Of course. Ethan glanced toward his siblings to make sure they were distracted. Then he looked directly at Alexander. If you knew about us before, would you have come? The question struck with unexpected force. Naomi grew still beside him. Alexander crouched slightly so he could meet the boy's eyes. Every single time, he answered honestly. Ethan studied him carefully. Even when there are 4 of us. A laugh escaped before Alexander could stop it. Especially because there are 4 of you. Ethan nodded slowly, considering the answer. Then his voice became quieter. People leave sometimes. Alexander understood immediately. The fear behind the words had nothing to do with wealth or status. It came from uncertainty. From years spent wondering about someone he had never met. I know, Alexander said gently. But I am not planning to leave. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he gave a small nod. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. Yet somehow it felt like the most important conversation Alexander had ever had. Across the square, the holiday lights reflected in the snow while music drifted through the evening air. The children called for Ethan to join them. He started running toward his siblings, then suddenly stopped and looked back. See you tomorrow? He asked. Alexander smiled. Tomorrow. Ethan grinned and raced away. As Naomi watched her son disappear into the crowd, she realized that for the first time since this journey began, none of the children were asking whether Alexander would stay. They were beginning to assume he would. By the time January arrived, the rhythm of their lives had begun to change in ways none of them could have imagined only a few months earlier. Snow covered the sidewalks of Brooklyn, and the city moved beneath a blanket of white and silver. On most weekends, Alexander could now be found wherever the children happened to be. Sometimes that meant sitting through robotics competitions. Sometimes it meant helping build school presentations around a crowded dining table. Other times it meant simply showing up with hot chocolate after a long afternoon of activities. The remarkable thing was that the children no longer treated his presence as unusual. It had quietly become part of their normal life. One Saturday afternoon, Naomi returned home from a hospital shift to find the apartment unusually quiet. At first she worried something was wrong. Then she stepped into the living room and stopped. Ethan, Elijah, Emma, and Ella sat around the coffee table with Alexander. Scattered across the surface were old photographs, construction paper, markers, and family keepsakes. What is all this? Naomi asked. For excited faces immediately turned toward her. It is a school project, Emma announced proudly. Family Heritage Day, Ella added. Ethan held up a large poster board. We have to explain where we come from. Naomi smiled and removed her coat. That sounds important. Alexander looked almost amused by the chaos surrounding him. Apparently, I have been assigned glue duty. The children laughed. Naomi watched quietly as they continued working. For years, every family assignment had carried a hidden challenge. Questions about fathers. Questions about grandparents. Questions she always answered as honestly as possible. Today felt different. Not because everything was perfect, but because nobody seemed afraid of those questions anymore. Later that evening, after dinner, the children presented their finished project. Photographs filled the poster board. Naomi with the babies as newborns. First days of school. Birthday celebrations. Science fair ribbons. Community events. Then, near the center, were newer pictures. Alexander helping Ethan with a model rocket. Reading beside Ella at the library. Watching Emma perform at a recital. Teaching Elijah how to organize a presentation. The images were simple, ordinary, yet they carried enormous meaning. We wanted to show the whole story, Elijah explained. Not just part of it. Alexander felt emotion rise unexpectedly in his chest. He looked at the photographs and realized that for the first time, he could actually see himself becoming part of their lives. Not as a guest, not as a visitor, as family. The following week, the school hosted Family Heritage Day. Parents and relatives filled the gymnasium while students presented their projects. Naomi stood beside Alexander as the children proudly displayed their board. Visitors stopped repeatedly to admire it. Teachers praised the effort and creativity. Then one teacher asked a question that made everyone pause. What did you learn while making this project? The children exchanged glances. Finally, Ella stepped forward. That family is not just about where a story starts. Emma nodded. It is also about what happens next. Elijah smiled. Sometimes people spend years trying to find each other. Ethan looked toward Alexander and Naomi before finishing the thought. And sometimes they actually do. The teacher smiled warmly and moved on. But the words lingered. As the event continued around them, Alexander looked at the 4 children standing proudly beside their project. Naomi stood quietly at his side. For years, he had believed legacy meant buildings, investments, and business success. Standing there beneath the bright lights of a school gymnasium, surrounded by laughter and handmade projects, he finally understood how wrong he had been. Legacy was not something a person left behind. It was something a person invested in every day. And for the first time in his life, Alexander knew exactly where he wanted to invest the rest of his future. Spring returned to New York with bright skies and the promise of new beginnings. Nearly a year had passed since the afternoon when Alexander first crossed paths with four children who unknowingly changed his life. The city seemed warmer now, not because the weather had changed, but because something inside him had changed as well. On a sunny Saturday morning, Naomi and the children arrived at the school auditorium for the annual family celebration day. Colorful banners decorated the walls. Parents filled the rows of seats. Teachers moved through the crowd greeting families. The event had become a beloved tradition, giving students an opportunity to honor the people who mattered most in their lives. Alexander arrived carrying a small bouquet of flowers for Naomi and immediately found himself surrounded by four excited children. Ethan was eager to show him a new robotics award. Elijah wanted feedback on a science project. Emma had prepared a short piano performance. Ella had volunteered to help organize the ceremony. Their voices blended together in cheerful chaos, and Alexander smiled through every second of it. A year earlier, he would have considered such a morning ordinary. Now it felt priceless. As families settled into their seats, the principal stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone. The program began with music, student presentations, and stories about gratitude. Laughter and applause filled the auditorium. Then came the final segment. Several students had been selected to deliver speeches about the meaning of family. To Alexander's surprise, all four children had volunteered to speak together. The auditorium grew quiet as Ethan, Elijah, Emma, and Ella walked onto the stage side by side. Sunlight streamed through tall windows behind them, creating a warm, golden glow across the room. Ethan stepped forward first. When people hear the word family, they usually think about who was there from the beginning, he said confidently. But sometimes family is also about who chooses to stay. Elijah continued. We learned that people can spend years searching for answers. Sometimes those answers arrive when nobody expects them. Emma smiled toward the audience. We also learned that love does not become smaller when it is shared. It becomes bigger. Then Ella took a deep breath. And most importantly, we learned that second chances are real. The audience listened in complete silence. The children exchanged glances before Ethan spoke again. For a long time, we thought someone was missing from our story. Elijah nodded, but maybe he was searching for us too. Emma looked directly toward Naomi. Our mom taught us kindness. Ella's eyes found Alexander in the crowd, and someone taught us that showing up matters. Then all four children smiled. Together, they taught us what family really means. Applause filled the auditorium. Some parents wiped away tears. Teachers smiled proudly. Naomi sat frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. Beside her, Alexander could not speak at all. Every missed year, every regret, every unanswered question seemed to dissolve beneath the simple truth standing on that stage. When the ceremony ended, the children ran into the audience. Naomi embraced them first. Moments later, Alexander joined the hug. For several seconds, none of them moved. Around them, families gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, but the six of them remained together beneath the warm spring sunlight. Alexander looked at Naomi, then at the four children surrounding them. His empire would one day belong to someone else. Buildings would change. Companies would evolve. Wealth would come and go. Yet standing there with the people he loved, he finally understood what legacy truly meant. It was not measured by what a person owned. It was measured by the lives they touched, the promises they kept, and the family they chose every day. And for the first time in many years, Alexander Hayes felt completely, undeniably home.